Okay. So we're going to talk tonight about the eComms net. eComms is emergency communications. And of course, it's not going to work. There we go. So we're going to talk about eComms in the USA. I'm not going to talk about other countries. Other countries do their own thing. They have their own programs, they have their own agencies, etc. I don't know anything about those other than the fact that they exist. For example, in the UK, they have a thing called RayNet UK that they use to manage their emergency services with amateur radio. That's about all I know about it. If you need information on another country because you're traveling there, or someone is watching this video later and they're from a different country, you can try Googling for amateur radio emergency and your country name, and you may find something useful. That's how I found RayNet UK. All right. So what is a net? Wait, we talked about this last week, right? We've been here before, and there's a link here to the presentation from last week. A net is basically an on-air gathering of amateur radio operators. Last week, I had a nice picture with several great-looking amateur radio operators, and I decided not to include that this week. We're going to be a little more professional this week. So, okay. So let's talk about eComms first. eComms is emergency communications. So what is an emergency, or what constitutes an emergency? An emergency is any type of accident or crisis where people and or property are in distress or at risk, okay? So typically the name emergency came from the word emergent, which means it happened spontaneously, right? It's not something that you were expecting. And that's kind of the nature of emergency communications, is we will be suddenly pressed into service. Oh, Dan's going to pantomime something for us. Go ahead, Dan. First word coming up, growing. Grass, okay.
Is according to that definition, my grass is an emergency? It is in distress.
According to this definition, Dan's grass in his yard is an emergency because it is not having a happy summer, apparently. Yeah, I don't know if that would count. I don't think, while grass is technically property, I don't think that really qualifies. All right, so how do we know it's an emergency? I'm going to play a little audio clip here. And if anybody knows or recognizes this and can tell me what it's from, I will be very pleased. But I don't have any prizes for you, unfortunately.
This is an emergency announcement. Emergency. There's an emergency going on. It's still going on. It's still an emergency.
Holly from Red Dwarf.
That's right. So that's from season 2 or season 1, episode 4, I think, of Red Dwarf. It was a BBC science fiction show where Dave Lister found himself very ill, and he passed out in the corridor, and Holly announced that Holly is the computer that runs the ship. Holly announced that there was an emergency, and Holly was very deadpan in his announcement. But yes, we'll be told that it's an emergency. That's how we'll know it's an emergency. Okay. Emergencies are generally recognized or declared by some kind of authority, whether that be a government agency or a non-governmental organization. It could be like the Red Cross or somebody like that. But it will be some type of an authority that is qualified to declare that as an emergency. We as amateur radio operators are typically not qualified to declare an emergency. We may be affiliated with a government or public agency who will actually make the determination that there is an emergency going on. Rather, as Holly insinuated, an emergency is going on, it's still going on, and it's still an emergency, right? So examples of emergencies are things like weather events, like a hurricane, tornado, typhoon, major thunderstorm or hailstorm. Which of those would we be likely to see here in Utah? Hailstorms, thunderstorms. What was that? High wind. High wind is one we definitely see here, right? Natural disasters like earthquakes, tsunamis, wildfires. We definitely see wildfires here. Floods. I was expecting flooding this year because of all the snow that we had. But amazingly, the work that's been done over the past, what, 30 years, 40 years, has actually been successful and kept us from having any major floods that I, I didn't hear about any this year.
More the weather not keeping up rather than the ill.
Ragnar thinks the weather was nice to us rather than that anything was planned well. But as far as flooding goes, if you're in, down in the Canyonlands area down there in southern Utah, a thunderstorm, even 100 miles away, can cause a flash flood event close to where you happen to be. So, flooding is definitely a factor here in Utah. Dan.
Before you turn the slide, I do have one comment.
Okay. And then the last things, of course, are man-made disasters like an active shooter, riot, terrorism, war, cyber attack, or major accident, something like that. Those would be considered an emergency type situation.
I'm gonna go with the weather one, which we're experiencing now, is
The high heat.
the high heat.
Heat is another one. In some cities, heat stroke is a bigger killer than any of these other types of events. And also here in Utah, earthquakes are probably our most likely natural disaster. Although we do seem to have wildfires every year and we don't have huge earthquakes every year. So maybe it's a matter of scale, right? And, the impact of an event. The impact of a large scale earthquake here would be much greater than the impact of even several wildfires, most likely. Dan.
And I just want to put a caveat on your second bullet point where it says we'd be told it's an emergency. We don't declare an emergency for other people. We can declare an emergency for us. I can go out there on the radio and say, break, 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 mayday, mayday, there's an active shooter here. That's declaring an emergency. But typically, well, not typically, we are not. It's not in a preview to declare an emergency for other people.
So Dan points out that it's not in our realm of responsibility to declare an emergency for others, but if we are experiencing an emergency situation, we are within our rights to declare that that's happening. For example, if you happen to come along a 20-car pileup on the freeway and you're the first person there who has any kind of radio connectivity and you need to reach out, you can call Mayday and declare that as an emergency situation. I'm assuming it'd be somewhere where cell phones aren't working for whatever reason. Likewise, as Dan's example was an active shooter situation, if you encountered that, if it was happening around you, you could certainly get on the radio and declare that and have another operator assist you in getting law enforcement involved or getting
Or you're
government
hiking
officials involved.
and you have no cell phone and you're lost. You declare it.
Yeah, he also points out, I know the TERT group, Timpanogos Emergency Response Team, they encounter hikers quite often who were ill prepared for their hike and they find themselves stuck on the mountain in the middle of the night. And that can be considered an emergency situation because their life is at risk. So, that's a situation that could occur.
When I was involved with the Civil Patrol and we had a lot of contact with the news media, the National always told us that it's just better to mention what happened rather than declaring any kind of thing. You can just, we have this flood going on here, or this car is, just mention what happened rather than naming it.
So Ragnar points out that when he was involved with Civil Air Patrol, the national CAP organization advised the units that it was better when communicating with public media like newscasters or whatnot about a situation. It was better to just explain what was happening rather than say we're having an emergency necessarily. So that's a good point to take into account. So let's talk about some different types of emergency net. So depending on the nature of the emergency, you may encounter several different types of net, right? Or you could have one net that encompasses all of these types of things. It depends on the scale of the event. So There are four basic types of nets that I'm going to talk about. The tactical, which is managing individual resources directly involved. So you're actually like on the ground dealing with a situation. Command nets are keeping track of the big picture. Resource nets are specifically for managing people, equipment, and supplies. And information nets are for sharing information with the public, with other amateur radio operators, with other groups and teams, and providing welfare traffic both inside and outside of an affected area. So we're going to dig into these a little bit more.
I'm assuming that you could have all four of those, but I'm.
All four of those could be going on as separate nets. You may have several resource nets happening. And yeah, you would want to separate them out on different frequencies so that you're not colliding with each other, depending on the situation, right? You may have a situation where the command net and a resource net are running on the same frequency because the activity on the command net is very sporadic. But the resource net, is jumping in and using the frequency periodically along the way. So we'll talk about that more as we go a little further. So an example of a tactical net. So say your CERT group is actively looking at homes to determine if they're stable or if they have victims in them, or, trying to get people out or whatever. You may operate a tactical net in that case, right there on the scene, where you've got search teams, recovery teams, a medical triage team, and you want to have an amateur radio operator with each of those teams so that everyone can be aware of what's going on. So when we did our last CERT training back in October, and for those who don't know, CERT is the Community Emergency Response Team. So it's a public program. The Murray Fire Department provides a class in this at least once a year. I think they're trying to do it twice a year. It usually is about 4 to 5 sessions, usually a couple hours each. And when you come out of that, you have a good idea of what's safe to do and what's not safe to do in an emergency type of situation. And you actually get to participate in an exercise where you go into a building and try to find victims and recover them. So it's kind of cool. It's fun. I definitely recommend taking that training if you have any interest at all. So, this type of net is often ad hoc. It's typically not directed. The key factor is that everybody involved is able to communicate with each other, and you may require a number of radio operators to embed with other teams, right? We encountered this when we were doing our training and we did our evaluation exercise at the end. We had, how many operators did we have, Dad? We probably had 7 or 8 of us there, and the group was about 20 people that we were working with. So maybe 15 to 20 people. So, we actually put amateur radio operators with each of the teams so that when a search team found a victim, they could identify that, get a recovery team over there, and then move on and continue the search while the recovery team took them out. And they would do things like a quick evaluation and notify the medical triage team what they were going to be getting in the next few minutes as they recovered that person, so that they could have some idea and be prepared to be able to respond to that. And it seemed to go fairly well. And in fact, the fire department said that our team did the best of any class that they've seen. So very useful to have amateur radio operators involved in that. And it was a very, very ad hoc net. We had essentially a person who was at the triage site who was the incident commander, and that was Sherwood. And he kind of acted as a net control, but it was pretty ad hoc, right? It was there was not asking permission to talk and things like that. It was just people were announcing what they were doing and what they were encountering along the way, and it worked out pretty well. So let's see. Let's talk about a command net. So let's say a natural disaster has been declared, and the scope of it has overwhelmed the public service radio system. So this is one of the reasons why our club exists. The fire department here recognizes the fact that the public service radio system that they have access to works great 99% of the time. But if there was ever a large scale earthquake in the area, it would be overwhelmed immediately. Yeah, Vern, go ahead.
Isn't that one of the criteria for defining an emergency as an overwhelming the existing resources? that we normally have?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Vern's comment is that that's one of the things that defines an emergency, is that it overwhelms the available resources to deal with the situation. You know, if it was a case of, you know, somebody fell down the stairs, you call 911, the fire department shows up, they take the person to the hospital, no big deal, right? But in a situation where the earthquake has happened and 150 buildings have fallen down, there's no way the fire department is going to be able to get to 150 buildings, and the phone system is going to be completely bogged down with traffic, and the public service radio network is going to be completely bogged down with traffic, most likely.
That disqualifies.
If it's even working, right? What was that, Vern?
That disqualifies things.
That disqualifies damned lawn, he said. So yes, that's a factor, I guess. So in a case like this, the city may have asked amateur radio operators to aid in communications. So you put a couple of operators at the EOC, you've got other amateur radio operators stationed at the safe neighborhood schools, you've got them at the local hospital, you've got them at other locations as needed. I've identified a few possibilities here: city parks, public utility locations, shelters, that kind of thing. Individual needs are funneled through these operators to ensure that the incident commander has the situational awareness they need to be able to respond appropriately to the emergency, right? And so that's a case where you would need some kind of a net to manage that communications. You don't want 40 operators hopping on the radio and all of them screaming, hey, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this. You want to manage that communications appropriately so that you don't encounter situations where somebody's not getting heard, someone's not getting the resources that they need, right? Nothing hurts an emergency more than having a ton of resources in one location and not knowing that they're needed at another location. So, you know, we are pretty geographically dispersed over the city of Murray, and I feel pretty strongly that we would be able to jump in and help out. I do want to say, though, if an emergency happens, your first responsibility is to yourself and your family. Make sure you and your family are safe before you start trying to help anybody else. Because if you are worried about your family, you're not going to be effective helping other people. And, you know, it's just, I don't want people to feel like they're obligated to get out there and help someone else if they are encountering a situation that they can't deal with themselves, right? You don't want to add to the number of victims. So take care of your stuff first, then help out where you can. All right, so let's talk about a resource net. Resource nets are typically run using the Incident Command System, ICS. We're gonna talk briefly about that, but that's a pretty big topic, and we'll probably save discussion of the ICS until another class. So, but ICS is the Incident Command System. It takes care of things like making sure that messages are responded to and communicated effectively, right? And it helps you to do that in an efficient fashion. And there are several forms and things that are associated with that. We'll talk about that in another class. But basically the resource net can bridge the gap between tactical nets and the command net. So the net control on the command net is basically, and the resource net is responsible for assigning roles and positions as volunteers check into this resource net. So keep in mind, resources are not just bandages, water, food, shelter, that type of thing, but people are resources as well, and they need to be managed as well. People, transportation, all of those kinds of things are resources. And so a resource net can control that information and that distribution of those things. So they receive requests for information, supplies, and personnel and direct them to the appropriate source. This type of net is usually spun off from a command net when the command net gets too busy. So when the incident first starts, The command net is probably doing all of this. But at some point, you're going to get to the point where there are enough people involved, you can't keep up with it all on the command net, and you break out into multiple resource nets to be able to handle that level of traffic. And then finally, we'll talk about information nets. So these nets are typically open, fairly free form. They're not usually controlled or directed. And the goal here is to collect and distribute information. They can also provide notice that a more formal net may be activated at any time, right? These nets are also used for dissemination of public welfare traffic. Now, public welfare traffic is, let's say there was an earthquake here and your family is okay, but you want to let your sister in Michigan know that you're okay. Well, you can't call her because the phones are down. So your best shot is to get a message into an information net that can get that out of the area via HF or some other means and get that information delivered to your family members outside of the location that you are safe and you're okay, right? That would be a welfare type of situation. One thing I want to talk about on information nets is we as radio operators need to be very careful to only disseminate information, not opinions, right? So if you think something is happening, but you don't know it for sure, don't put it out on the net, right? That's not information, that's opinion or supposition. So you don't want to push any disinformation out there. You want to make sure that you're sticking to the facts that you know them, right? If you're given information from a command net and said, distribute this, that's okay. Even though you're not a firsthand recipient of that, you can say, I was told by XYZ authority that this is the situation that's going down right now, right? So, you know, you're distributing information as you know it.
That's very important to include who's giving the information to you.
Ragnar points out, yes, it is very important to include where that information is coming from, right? So it's not like, you know, a guy just ran up and told me that, you know, 6 cars were upside down in the field over there. That's not necessarily information, right? But if the incident commander says, we are encountering, you know, a lot of situations where looters are over in this area, stay away from that area. That would be something you could say. Incident command has advised us that people are looting in this area, stay out of that area, right? Dan.
In addition, for Salt Lake County areas, we just have a new public information officer called from the section manager to handle this type of traffic in a declared emergency.
So Dan points out that Salt Lake County Aries has a public information officer whose responsibility is to disseminate this type of information. So that person would likely be in charge of or running this information, this type of information net as the incident's going on. We'll talk more about Aries in a minute here, but before we get to Aries, let's talk about Skywarn. So how many people are familiar with Skywarn? A few hands, okay. So Skywarn is basically an organization or group of citizens who are interested in the weather and are willing to report severe weather conditions as they encounter them to the National Weather Service. There is a program called the CWOP, the Civilian Weather Observation Program, where if you've got a weather station at your house, you can plug that in and distribute your collected weather information directly to the NWS, and they will use that in forecasting. It's actually pretty cool and it's pretty popular. So if you do have a weather station at home, I encourage you to look into how you can participate in that program. Typically,
like certain brand names.
like certain brand names of weather equipment, of weather station equipment. You know, there's an issue where some pieces of, like some weather stations that you can buy make it easy to interface to a computer and others do not. Like for example, my son has one that you know, it's a great little system. It's got a wireless sensor pack that is mounted on the roof, and it's got a little display in the house. And it communicates over his Wi-Fi and uploads his weather information to a particular weather monitoring group. But it's not the CWOP. And there's no easy way to get the weather out of that station directly into a format that he could do something with if he wanted to. He can get it from the organization that it gets uploaded to, but that's depending on the internet working and all kinds of crazy stuff happening, right? So, you know, that's neither here nor there. Yeah, Gary.
Yeah, we did a training with, a few years back.
We participated in a Skywarn Appreciation Day, I know. And, you know, there was some other things that have gone on with Skywarn here in the area that some of us have been able to participate in. So Skywarn, typically you'll have local groups. They'll run a net on VHF, UHF, simplex, or a repeater. Observers can report their observations. Again, it's very important to use the specific language that's associated with the particular thing. For example, in hailstones are described as far as their size. And there are certain keywords that you use when describing the size of hailstones. And there are other keywords that people do tend to use that are not official. And I think one of them is, what is it? It's like baseball sized is not an official size or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So that's not an official one, right? That's yeah, oh well, that's the way it goes. But yeah, so it's important that you use the correct terminology and designations. And that's why Skywarn does some training to help people learn and understand what they're actually reporting and how to report it correctly. Net control for the local nets will typically use a variety of means, maybe the internet, maybe HF, to report those observations to the National Weather Service. These nets are typically considered to be what they call liaison nets, and they're typically directed, and the level of formality is determined by the control operator, right? So it may be, you know, if you were up in Jackson, Wyoming, where you've got, you know, maybe 20 or 30 operators who are involved in Skywarn, that may be a much lower level of control than if you were in Los Angeles and you've got, you know, 500 to 700 operators involved, right? And where you may have to be, you know, run a very directed, controlled net down there. So these types of nets are often run by ARES, Amateur Radio Emergency Service Groups. We're going to talk about ARES. So one more comment on Skywarn?
Yeah, like 25 years ago, there was a hurricane in Hawaii, and nobody could contact them from Hawaii to the coast using HR, but they could get just here to Salt Lake and up in Wyoming, Colorado. So they're depending on, because VHF, UHF was worthless, but they were doing HF, but according to the skip and weather and all that,
Getting the information where it needed to go was difficult, right?
yeah, well, it went here, and then we sent it back to the coast from here, rather than Hawaii to the coast.
So Ragnar points out that in a particular instance, information was being distributed via HF, and because of propagation issues with HF, sometimes you had to do creative routing to get your messages through to where they needed to go. So that's something to keep in mind, and it's a good thing to practice, right? So even when a severe weather condition is not happening, figure out what stations you can talk to on a regular basis, how far away they are, where they are, that kind of thing. That's good information to have, because when the emergency happens, you don't want to be taking the time to figure out how to do all of that. You want to already know. I'm going to actually back up for a minute here, because there is a comment from Dan on the Zoom. Dan asks, how do you manage third-party communication versus relaying messages? For example, if a non-ham with medical training needs to give directions or instructions, it may be simpler to hand the mic over for a minute instead in those situations. That, Dan, I think something you have to take on a case-by-case basis. Normally, when you're running a net for an emergency situation, you want to keep written down the traffic that's happening. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but in those cases, having them actually write it out and then you read the message over the air is better, because it makes sure that they don't get it wrong, you don't get it wrong, the receiver doesn't get it wrong, and the person who's actually doing whatever needs to get done doesn't get it wrong. Now, in a situation where, you know, somebody is choking and they don't know how to do the Heimlich and you're trying to explain that to them over the radio, then it may make sense to hand the mic to the doctor and say, tell them how to do the Heimlich in layman's terms, because I know how to do it, but I don't know how to explain it, right? And that is something in a situation where it might be an expeditious to let them do it as a third party rather than trying to write it down and then transfer it. But that's something you would have to evaluate on a per situation basis. So, okay. So let's go back to Skywarn. Then, so we were done with Skywarn. So Aries. Aries is the amateur radio emergency service.
Engine 81 and
Hang on a second.
ambulance 81. Respond to seizures at 5181 South State Street. Respond on deck fire 2 near 100 East. Engine 81 and medic ambulance 81. Respond to seizures at 5181 South State Street. Respond on deck fire 2 near 100 East. Timeout 1904. Respond on deck fire 2 near 100 East. Timeout 1904.
For the fire stations. So I was able to see their dispatch board the last call. There was one call they had, this guy, 19-year-old male. Obviously really had some problems. He thought he was possessed by Satan.
John just was describing a situation when he worked in Mesa and had to visit a fire station at one point and saw on their dispatch board, we just had a dispatch event happen, saw that someone, you know, a 19-year-old male thought he was Satan. And he was wondering just how do emergency responders respond to something like that? And yeah, that's a good question, because that's one of those situations where it's like you need to be cognizant of who you're dealing with, and not being the Prince of Darkness, but being, you know, a normal citizen who is confused. And but there is always that chance that he might really be, you know. But no, I mean, I don't know how you would deal with that. I think they have training that covers that, but that's probably outside the scope of our conversation tonight. Okay, so Aries, amateur radio emergency service. Aries is managed and operated by the ARRL, the American Radio Relay League, which is a nonprofit organization of amateur radio operators here in the United States. They support local, state, federal, tribal governments, and non-governmental organizations. And they typically will participate in drills, training exercises, and provide access to training materials for their members. Aries members are encouraged to participate in other agencies and groups such as CERT, Red Cross, RACES, etc. So basically around here, Aries, there's a Utah Aries organization, and then there's a Salt Lake County Aries organization. And I don't think it goes any more granular than that around here, does it, Dan? So yeah, Dan confirms that county is the smallest level. And so there are people who are assigned various roles within that, and operators who have joined Aries are, you know, available or making themselves available to respond to situations. So it's an organization that supports this type of emergency communications. Let's talk about RACES. So RACES is the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. It's a little bit different. All RACES events will always be activated by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. RACES operators are certified by an official government civil defense agency. They operate in drills, exercises, and emergencies, just like Aries does. They are typically activated by local, county, or state organizations as needed. RACES operators are the only group that are authorized to operate when the Emergency War Powers Act has been invoked by the President of the United States. So if the country goes to war and the President invokes the Emergency War Powers Act, amateur radio operators are not allowed to get on the air when something like that happens. It's just like over in Ukraine, amateur radio operators are not supposed to be operating right now because they're at war, right? But RACES operators have been authorized to operate in this situation. Now they are operating under very tight controls and working very closely with their controlling organizations and FEMA, but they are the only ones authorized to operate. And they may also be authorized to operate using other protocols, not amateur radio protocols, as part of the National Incident Management System. They may find themselves using public service radios to communicate with organizations, or using other communication means as needed to do their job, right? So RACES is a little bit different from Aries. Let's talk about some of the differences.
Has RACES can go as small as to the state one, or can it be the county?
I believe it's at the state level. So Dave asked if RACES is at the county level as well, or just at the state level. And I believe it is operated at the state level, and Dan confirmed that. So let's talk about Aries versus RACES for a minute. So Aries is sponsored by the ARRL, which is a private organization. Aries stations have no official capacity, and Aries stations can operate before, during, and after an event happens. And Aries stations can communicate with other stations as necessary within the limits of their licenses. Right now, of course, in an actual emergency situation, the rules are basically set aside because we as amateur radio operators are authorized to use whatever means is necessary when somebody's life is at risk. So if you happen upon a police patrol car and the officer was laying on the ground next to it after having been shot, you can grab that police car's microphone and make the call to the dispatcher and say, hey, I'm here with a police officer. I'm an amateur radio operator. He's here, he's alive, or he's not, whatever the situation is. And this is the location. Get somebody out here as fast as you can. You can do that. That's legal for you to do, even though you're not necessarily supposed to use a public service radio. In an emergency situation, you can. That doesn't apply during drills, right, or exercises. So only in a bona fide emergency situation. RACES, on the other hand, is sponsored and regulated by the government. So FEMA and Department of Homeland Security are in charge of RACES. They have certain responsibilities and certain restrictions, and those restrictions and responsibilities are defined in the rules in Section 97, 407, Section 407, subsection 407. These restrictions may limit the frequencies you can operate on. They may limit the stations you're allowed to communicate with when you're acting as a RACES station. One of the interesting factors is that RACES drills are limited by statute to 1 hour per week and up to 2 72-hour exercises per year. And that's spelled out in Section 97, subpart 407, subsection D4, where it actually says that. That's the rule. Now, people are like, why in the world would they have that rule? And the reason they have that rule is because when RACES first started happening, cities and towns were like, we're going to have a drill every day. And we're going to drill for 6 hours a day. And if you want to play, amateur radio operators, you're going to play our way and you're going to do our thing. And so these rules were put in place to limit how much of that was going on and how impactful it would be on the amateur radio operators. Unfortunately, those same rules impact us in the other direction as well and restrict how much we are able to help, right? RACES is typically only activated during the actual emergency. You can't activate a RACES net before the emergency happens or after it's done, it's over. Once the emergency is declared resolved, RACES is done. And RACES operators may be authorized to communicate with other radio services as deemed necessary by the civil defense organization that's running the show, right?
Races, oh, I'm sorry, races works like FEMA.
Races works with FEMA, right? Yeah.
And which means if there's an emergency and you're right there, you can't do anything
Until somebody tells you to, right? Yeah.
Like Katrina, like the people here had to wait in Texas before they could go to Katrina, and everyone yelled because they weren't doing anything. Well,
They weren't allowed to do anything, right? Yeah, exactly. Ragnar points out when you're in races and or even, in any kind of situation where FEMA is in charge, you're not allowed to just jump in and start doing stuff unless they have told you to do it, right? So here's an interesting thing. You can belong to both Aries and races. In fact, both the ARRL and FEMA recommend that you belong to both. Okay. So just because you feel like, well, I want to be part of Aries, I like their way of doing things, doesn't mean you can't be part of races as well, and vice versa, right? And you can switch between operating under Aries rules and races rules as the event requires. So if you find yourself in a situation where the emergency hasn't been declared yet, you can get started as an Aries organization doing things. And then when FEMA rolls in and says, we're going to activate races now, you can say, oh, great, I'm a races station as well. So now I will function as a races station and do what needs to be done. Right. So
And
you're.
you shall not claim.
Dan wants to make sure you realize that they are not the same. If you're operating as a races station, you're operating as a races station. If you're operating as an Aries station, you're not a races station when you're doing that, right? If you want to join Aries, there's a form you need to fill out. You don't need to be a member of ARRL to be part of Aries. That was one thing that I wasn't sure about until I looked it up, because I was thinking, well, I'm not an ARRL member. Can I even be a part of Aries? Yes, you can. So you fill out this form, you send it to the local emergency coordinator. If you don't know who that is, then look for the section manager for your Aries group, or just give it to Dan. For races, you need to contact your local civil defense department. Here in Utah, there's a particular page owned by the Utah Dem, which is not related to Democrats at all. It's the Department of Emergency Management. And they have a web form that you can fill out and send it in, and they will get back to you if they accept you as a races member, right? So it may be a while. So just be aware of that. Dan or Dave.
Since you have races number.
Races will assign you a races number if they accept you as a member. That is correct. And typically when you're doing a races net, they will have you check in not only with your call sign, but with your races number as well. I don't know if Aries does anything similar to that, or if it's just your call sign. Dan says it's just your call sign. So. All right. So let's talk about the net control operator station. Net control station is responsible for the operation of the net. We kind of talked about this a little bit last week, where the net control basically is running the net, right? A net control station may have one or more net control operators. And the net control keeps track of the messages, their source, their destination, if they have been delivered, and if they have been responded to. So you want to be aware of the fact that if I'm working a message net and I'm passing information around, I want to keep track of who I've given the information to, that it got to the right place. If they responded, that the response got to the right place, right? Because you want to, if somebody comes up to you afterwards and says, hey, the hospital said they needed bandages and we sent some, did they ever get them? You want to be able to look at your logs and say, yes, they got them at such and such a time. They reported that they received them, right? So you also keep track of the members of the net, where they're at, what their assignments are, and what their capabilities are. So it's important to know, I know this guy only has a handheld, right? And maybe only one battery. So he's going to be checking in every 15 minutes, but he's not going to leave his radio on all the time or something like that, right? In a particular situation. You want to know that up front and have a record of that information so that as you're making communications, you can do it appropriately. Dan.
On the application for the Aries, we also have, we ask for your capabilities. So we want to know what modes you can work, what type of radios you have, power, all that stuff. So so we have a record of what everybody should be able to handle, you know, on any given.
And things like emergency power and such not as well as, right? So Dan points out that when you apply for Aries, they collect some information from you, not just contact information, but also information about what equipment you have, what modes you can operate, you know, if you have emergency power or not, all that kind of information. So they have that information on file, which is very helpful. The other thing that a net control does is keeps records of all of this stuff. Record keeping is critical. And as a net control operator, you may bring in one or more scribes to write things down for you so that you can talk on the radio and the information can get written down. Yes.
I apologize, but this is important. Running a net like the Utah SAG or any type of event, every single message, doesn't matter what it is, every single message is documented. That's why we like to have at least 2 or 3 net controllers, because one of them is talking and the other one is typing it out. It is critical, especially when there's incidents involved, because there are times when we need to go back and get a history of what exactly happened, what preceded it, what happened after the fact. So it is critical.
Dan just reiterates that having a scribe and keeping track of the messages as they come in and go out is a critical factor when you're running a net control station. You need to know that information at any given moment. You need to be able to look back at your records and say, this is what was happening. This is what I did. This is what came in. This is what went out, that type of information. And so typically at, you know, any type of event, you will have multiple operators available at the net control station. And while someone's talking on the radio, someone else is writing down what's being said, what's being communicated, where it's coming from, where it's going. All of that information is getting logged. All right. Net control operators need to possess certain qualities to be effective. One of the most important ones, and this is one that sometimes people don't realize, you've got to be able to speak clearly and distinctly and be understood on the radio, not just in the room talking to the computer, but on the radio, right? It doesn't do you much good if the person who's the net control operator, English is their third language, and maybe they don't know all the words that are going to be used. You want to have somebody who knows what they're talking about. Ragnar, your fourth language, but you've been speaking English for how many years? I think you would qualify.
3 or 4.
3 or 4 dozen, right? Yeah, so correspondingly good hearing is also critical, and the ability to handle stress, both mental and physical. I found a notice that said that, you know, air traffic control operators and public service radio dispatchers understand this requirement maybe more than we do as amateur radio operators. My son's father-in-law was an air traffic controller for many years, and they develop a cadence in how they talk to be able to get their commands or messages moved around in aviation. That, you know, there's a very well-defined pattern that they use, and they do that on purpose because then mistakes don't get made, right? You don't forget the information that you need to send if you always send it the same way every time. But these people have stressful positions, and they have to learn how to deal with that. You have to have the ability to focus. You may find yourself in a noisy environment or a chaotic environment when you're sitting over at the EOC and people are running around and yelling and trying to figure out what's going on. You need to be able to operate in that kind of an environment. So, you know, being able to stay focused on what you're doing is important. You need to have good penmanship, and I'm pretty terrible in that regard, but I can type really fast. So I make up for it by just using a keyboard instead. But remember, documentation is critical. We got to keep track of our documentation. It has to be legible to others. Doesn't do you much good if you're the only one who can read it, right? Doctors don't make good net control operators. So maybe they can handle stress pretty well, but have you seen a doctor's penmanship? Yeah, don't. So
I think that's why a lot of the prescriptions are set electronically.
yes, they have switched to using electronic prescriptions for nearly everything now, because then they don't end up having, the pharmacist doesn't end up having to call the doctor back and say, what exactly were you trying to prescribe here? Oh, paracetamol? Oh, okay. That's what that is. It looks like a line to me. Right. So anyway, knowledge of the incident command system and the forms is very useful, something that you can get training on before the emergency happens. And we highly recommend that you have training on that. And operators who are differently abled may still be able to assist with things. So if you have an operator who is blind or hearing impaired, they may still be able to be a good net control operator, just on a different mode or in a different fashion than, somebody, if they're hearing impaired, obviously they're not going to be doing phone, but they could be managing a digital mode in some way. And they could be very effective at doing that, because they're not going to be bothered by the noisy environment that they're in. Or if you have someone who's blind, maybe they are great with voice modes and can really hear and pick out details that you wouldn't otherwise be able to hear in a noisy radio call. But obviously they can't see the forms, so they have to relate things verbally, right? So those are things that, you may find yourself, if you're differently abled in some way, you may find that you can still be an effective net control operator and assist. So let's talk about some radio technique that need to be used on emergency communications nets. So a lot of these apply to everybody on the net. Some of them apply more to the net control operator, but we're just going to talk about some basic radio techniques. One of the first and most important ones is listening. I have lost count of the number of times I've tried to explain something to someone and they just weren't getting it because they weren't hearing what I was saying. I recently heard an example of this. This guy is a pilot and he was flying and he was on, I think, the downwind, which is like he's flying along the runway before turning to land, right? And there was another plane behind him. And he wanted to make sure that that pilot saw him. And so he called on the radio and asked that guy, do you see me? And the other guy said, I see you on my iPad. And what he's doing is he's looking at his iPad where he's got the chart up and he's got Adsby reading the location and he can see the other plane right there. And he says, no, can you see me? I'm quarter mile in front of you. Can you see me? Yeah, I see you on my iPad. No, look out the window. Do you see me? Right? And it took him 3 calls on the radio to get this guy to actually look outside the airplane and see where he was and say, yes, I visually see you. Right? But that's a case where the guy wasn't listening. Oh yeah, I see you. I know where you are. I can see you right here. You're on right there, like half an inch in front of me. No big deal, But he wasn't listening to what the other pilot was asking for. So that's a case where Dave points out sometimes some deaf people may be better at listening than hearing people can. So avoid unnecessary transmission, leave extra time between talking, spend that time listening, right? So you want to be listening, you want to hear what's happening out there. Microphone technique is important. You want to minimize popping. You don't want to be like shouting into the microphone. You don't want it to be, where you're talking directly at the mic. A lot of times we try to tell people, hey, just hold the mic to the side, talk across it, and it'll work just fine. It'll pick up what you want to say. You won't get the popping noise or anything like that. That's something you can practice. Unfortunately, you can't usually hear yourself on the radio when you're talking, right? So you don't know if you're having bad microphone technique unless someone tells you. So when somebody does tell you, let's go back to step 1, listen. Take to heart what they tell you. Exercise brevity. Keep your transmissions to a minimum. You don't want to take the time to have a long, drawn-out conversation in the middle of an emergency. You want to think about what you're going to say, get on the radio, say what you need to say, and get off. Again, so you can listen. And other stations can talk if they need to, right? Use plain language. Avoid things like Q codes, 10 codes, things like that. We have some certain Q codes that we tend to use even on phone, like QTH and QSL and things like that. You should avoid using those in an emergency situation. And in all honesty, you should probably avoid using them all the time, because the habits that you build in normal operating are the habits that you are going to exercise in an emergency situation. You won't be thinking about it. But one of the key factors is clarity of what you're saying, right? And if you start throwing Q signals around and some operator that you're talking to isn't familiar with those, they may not understand what you're talking about. And they may be embarrassed to admit that they don't understand it. So they may just go on without knowing what you're actually telling them. So think about that. Use standard phonetics. Avoid customized phonetics. We've all heard the guy who gets on the radio and says, yeah, this is kilowatt 7, bananas are tasty, right? Well, bananas are tasty. Is that BRT or is that BAT? Or, what are you telling me here? What's your call sign? Use standard phonetics. They were designed for a reason. You should stick with them. And again, that's a case of don't do that just in an emergency. Do that all the time when you're operating, because you want to build good habits in your normal operating. Then you don't have to forget the good habits when you are in an emergency situation. When you're requesting information, listen carefully so you don't miss anything. Listen. And when stations need to go direct, we'll talk more about that in a minute, hand them off to a different frequency so you can keep the primary frequency clear. If two stations want to talk to each other direct, you can let them do that. Just get them off on the main frequency. All right. More radio technique. Be concise when you're giving instructions or information. Use as few words as possible to get the message across. Why? So you can stop talking and start listening, right? You don't want to be hogging the frequency with your instructions. You want to make your instructions terse, to the point, and accurate, so that you don't have to be on the air as much as possible, right? Take frequent breaks. This one was one that I hadn't really thought about it until I read about this, and it was like, hey, you know what? At least every 2 hours, you need to take a break. Let the other net control operator take over the mic. You go somewhere where you don't sit and listen to the net. You're not taking a break if you're sitting there listening to the net. Go somewhere where you are taking a break for 15 minutes, where you're not involved, and just actually relax and let yourself decompress a little bit. Then you can go back in and jump back into the role, right? Into helping out. Vern.
Sign language interpreter professionals usually work in pairs. And they work 20 minutes. Because you have physical activity and you also have mental activity, translating from English into ASL, which is not the same.
Vern points out that sign language translators, or the people who are doing sign language interpretation for a speaker or something like that, they typically will work in pairs, and they'll work 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off, because you don't want to have to you're actually thinking hard when you're doing that type of an exercise, right? And you don't want to get burned out. When you get burned out, that's when you make mistakes. We do have a comment online here from Dan. People make up pretend phonetics because they can't remember the NATO alphabet. They need to practice saying and copying the NATO alphabet. And that's why I give call signs in NATO phonetics when I'm net control, because it helps me practice saying something other than my own call sign. And that's a great point. So, it certainly helps to practice all of the letters in the alphabet, not just the ones that are part of your call sign, right? Thanks for that comment, Dan. Let's see. Exercise control. Keep your voice calm, confident, speak with authority. You're in charge of the net. When you're net control, you're in charge, right? The net is yours. So you want to be authoritative, but you don't want to be rude. You don't want to be shouting at the mic or whatever. You want to be calm. You want to be confident, and you want to run the net. If the net is on a particular schedule, make sure you start on time. We are very careful about that with our club net. We start on time at 8 o'clock on Sunday nights, and we start promptly right at 8. And people have been very good about that. That's, it shows your level of professionalism when you can do that. Use a script when possible. We've talked about parts of a net and how to script those things like the preamble or informational announcements. Having a script written down that you can refer to will help you not make mistakes. Say you're working a practice event or an exercise. Every 20 minutes, you want to announce, this is an exercise for such and so organization. We are doing this on this frequency, blah, 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 so that other people who happen to tune in hear that and they will know what you're talking about. If you don't have it written down what you want to say, you might say it different every time. You might miss something. You might add things that you don't actually mean to add. So have a script. Dan.
Last night I was net control for areas, and I didn't realize I was using a wrong script because I had written out a bunch of training on this one particular script, and the beginning of it was the same. And so I was just actually going through that. And then I got to this training, and from there on out, it was all ad lib. My point is, even though you have a script, read it through a few times because things happen,
Dan points out, hey, even though you've got a script, familiarize yourself with that script before you need to read it on the air. We had this happen at the parade, right? Where the some of the bits in the parade list of floats didn't make much sense. And our poor radio personalities who were doing the announcing would encounter these as they're reading, and they would read it right off of the paper, just like they are programmed to do. And then they would finish and say to themselves, what in the world did I just say? That made no sense at all to anybody, right? John?
Yeah, I'll add too that, when I was a young lad and got my ticket, I was honored to, the gentleman back where I was living in rural Maine, they let me run a 2-meter net. And, so I think it was 16 years old at the time. And really, it's just on-the-job training, just practice makes perfect. Just throw you in there and see what happens.
Yeah, so John points out that when he was a new operator, he was probably 15 or 16 at the time, and one of the more seasoned operators had him run the 2-meter net where he was living back in Maine at the time. And, that's something that we do in our club is we try to make sure every club member has an opportunity to be net control for our net. We try to have a different operator every week, and it's always somebody in the club who, that they may have only done it once or twice before. But again, practice makes perfect, and being able to do it gives you the confidence when someone, some event happens and you need to step in and be in that control, you know what you're doing, you have an idea and you've done it before, right? So those are critical factors. Vern.
It's a good idea. There are operators who are, their things contest, they're on the air all the time. But running that is something they may not have done.
Vern points out you may have an operator who's been a radio operator for years, but all they do is contests, and so they know what they're doing, handling a pile up or whatever. But you hand them a net control script and say, hey, run this net, and they're like, I don't know how to do that, I've never done that. So it never hurts to get somebody, get that experience. Better to get the experience in a non-emergency situation than when you're sitting there with the building burning down around you, right? So and then the last thing I have on this slide, when asking for questions or giving instructions, be specific, be as specific as you can be, so that you don't have to have questions come back. Oh, you said such and so is delivering water. Can they deliver ice as well? Well, I should have said they're delivering water and ice, then you wouldn't have had to ask me that. And so be as specific as you can, but make sure you give the information that you have, and give it correctly. Okay. More radio technique, have pencil or pen and paper handy. You don't want to be hunting for it when you need to take notes, right? So I always carry a clipboard with a notebook on it and a couple of pens, because I don't want to be halfway through my event and all of a sudden my pen runs out of ink. And I'm sitting there going, well, that doesn't help me anymore. What am I going to do now? Well, if I have a second pen, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to fire up my second pen and go at it, right? But you want to be prepared for the note taking. You want to be ready to do that. Know your equipment. When an emergency happens, is not the time to figure out how to program your CTCSS tones in your radio. You need to already know that. You need to already understand how that works and how to do that, right? Let's see. When you hear a double, and that's something that we experience sometimes, you'll hear two stations try to check in at the same time, for example. Try to listen for something specific about one or the other of them, so that you can say, hey, the station ending with Q, can you go again? You doubled with another station. And then once they've had the opportunity to check in and pass their traffic, then you can say, okay, now the other station that tried to communicate at the same time as, what's his name, you go now, right? You want to recognize when that happens, and you want to be able to try to give that. I've been on nets where they say, oh, two stations doubled, try again. Oh, darn, you doubled again, try again. That doesn't really help. You need to be guide them a little bit. And this is something that, in networking, I'm a computer person, and I've worked with networking for 30 plus years. And on Ethernet, it uses a protocol called carrier detect collision avoidance, right? Close, something similar to that. Anyway, so each station on the network, when they come online, they listen first before they transmit. And if they don't hear another station talking, then they go ahead and transmit. Now they can detect if some other station collided with them at the same time. And when that happens, they do this back off, but they do what they call a random back off, where one station will back off a random amount and the other station will back off a random amount. And the hope is that it's not the same random amount on both sides, right? So that then when they retransmit, one station will get out there first, and then the other station will hear them, won't transmit until they're done. It's the same kind of situation on the radio, Vern.
2 points, pencils don't run out of ink.
But
But they
the
break.
tip can break.
They can break,
Yeah.
but if you have a pocket knife, you fix it. Last night, after the roll call was done, and then maybe even, it was after the roll call, Dan was running the areas data. I thought they did a wonderful job of saying, I heard this station come again, and ignored the other station completely, and just asked, okay, next check-in, please. But you did that with about 6 people.
Yeah, there's a lot of. And yeah, and some of them were just a single character,
Yeah.
The station with the 6, come back.
Right.
I mean, you just ask for that person.
Yeah.
and You get the net done.
Yeah.
Having to go through this back and forth.
Yeah, Vern and Dan just point out again, like when you hear that, it's two stations double, if you can identify one of them, even with just one character of their call sign, that can be enough to distinguish them so that you can ask for a specific one to respond, and then just move on and let the next station come in as they come, right? When you're doing check-ins, try to recognize the caller by name if you can. That makes people feel good about themselves. Hey, the net control operator knows who I am. That's awesome. And then they feel like they're a real participant in the net. So that's something that you can do. Frequently identify the name and the purpose of the net. New station, somebody might have tuned in, they don't know what's going on. I've had this happen, I don't know how many times, where I'll jump in the car, turn the radio on, and I'm halfway through some net's roll call. And I have no idea what the net is. I have no idea who they are. All I know is they're doing a roll call. And then at the end they say, okay, do we have any visitors? And I'm like, visitors to what? Do I check in? Do you want me to check in? I don't know if I should or not. Who are you? It's always good to say periodically who you are, what your net is for. Mention the PL tone if there is one, because sometimes the station just happens to hear you and they don't know, they might not have their radio configured for that. Dan, you had a comment.
I was just gonna say during the check-ins, when you recognize the callers by name, also knowing their voice really helps. And Sherwood was a great example. When you checked in, I could not understand you except I heard one syllable. And it was, I know that syllable because that is Sherwood. And so I says, yes, I didn't understand the word you said, but I got you in there. Did you hear my phone back?
Yes.
You hear me okay, right?
Yes, I heard you fine.
Yeah, so it's recognizing not only by name, but just the sound helps out.
Dan points out that sometimes you can recognize the tone of a person's voice or what they sound like on the radio. Even if you can't make out what they're actually saying, you know who it was because you recognize something about their voice. And that can be very helpful when you're handling check-ins, especially on a large scale net. Let's see, don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it. This is one, we all do this. Oh, I can do this. I can handle this. I'll just be the net control. No worries. I can run the show here. It'll be fine. Oh, you want to help? You want to be, my scribe? No, I've got it. Go do something else. I can handle it by myself. Take the help. And if you're running into a situation where it's getting out of control and you can't handle it anymore, that's when you spawn off one of those resource nets. Hey, operators doing this. I need you to form a resource net on such and so frequency. Go over there and do your thing. Come back to me with anything that needs to be directed to command, right? Delegate, push that off, ask for help when you need it. You will make mistakes. When you make a mistake, acknowledge it and move on. I've told some of you people about this experience I had when I was a teenager, when I was taking organ lessons. And my organ teacher also played the organ for the First Presbyterian Church in Great Falls, and they had a pipe organ. And she took me down there one time and let me play the pipe organ. And when you're playing a pipe organ, you're sitting at the console and the pipes are on the other side of the room, or they're, 20 yards away from you. They're somewhere away from where you are, right? And as you're playing, you don't hear what you are playing, you hear what you played a fraction of a second ago, because it takes time for that sound to get to you wherever you're, where your console is, where you're sitting. And so you learn very quickly, if I made a mistake, well, I already made it. It's done. It's gone. I'm just going to keep going. And that's what you have to do in radio as well. Once you've made that mistake, it's out there. You can't take it back. You can acknowledge it and move on. Oh, sorry, I made a mistake. It's really blah, blah, blah. And continue on with what you're doing, right?
I've played music a lot and made a lot of mistakes. And generally, if I make a mistake, I try to do it again to go later.
Ragnar says when he was playing music, if he makes a mistake, he tries to make that same mistake again later, and then people think it's how it's supposed to be. So that's an interesting point, Ragnar. I'll keep that in mind next time I'm playing the pipe organ. So don't think on the air. If you're in the middle of a thing and you need to stop and think about what you're going to say standby, unkey, think about it, figure out what you're going to say, and then key back up and say the rest of what you got to say. Remember, you don't want to be hogging the frequency, Gary. Or Stan, sorry.
I just wanted to say, when we were talking about doubling, I'm kind of a movie guy, so I experienced probably the worst doubling that ever happened in history. And I was working for the telephone company in a long distance switching office, and Kennedy was assassinated, and everybody was trying to get on their phone, and because of that, they didn't get any service. And I spent the whole day putting, fuses in. But the same thing happened with Amex radio. Everybody was on their Amex radio, and they didn't know that they were done, but they were talking. It created a problem, in communications in every aspect. Of course, that was years ago.
it still applies, right? Stan points out, when you're talking, you're not listening and you don't know if you're doubling with someone, right? So keep that in mind. And that it goes back to the key factor of listen first, right? Vern, you had a comment as well.
I was just gonna say the same thing. Point number one, list. An example of that is not something as dramatic, but just that some net operators would just want to get through the roll call so fast, and they never leave any space in there between them. Some people are a little slow keying up.
Yeah, we've had that happen before where, you know, you run through the roll call and then you call for missed check-ins and 6 people check in because they weren't fast enough on the draw to get in between your calls, you know. KD7 ZWV, nothing heard, moving on, you know, and poor KD7 ZWV is reaching for the microphone and all of a sudden you've moved on to the next station, right?
It's hard because there was like probably at least a half dozen last night where I was within a millisecond keying my mic to go to the next person and the person came on, you know, so that's been one of the things I've had to work on is just slow it down.
Leaving a little
You know,
more time,
I'm
yeah.
glad I do because I don't have to get those rechecks after.
And the other factor with that too is when you're leaving larger gaps, there's more room for somebody with emergency traffic to break in, right? So go ahead and leave a second or two for them to respond, or 3, you know, and that way there's a little extra time. I always think, you know, when I unkey, that is my break, right? My pause. And I want to wait at least 2 or 3 seconds before I even think about keying back up. Even if I'm in the middle of a part of the script and I finish one paragraph and I'm going to unkey to give the repeater a chance to reset, I'll wait a couple of seconds before I key back up and continue with the script, just in case another station needs to try to jump in there, right? So keep your transmissions short, keep them concise and to the point. Don't disseminate opinions or rumors, stick to the facts. If the net's been quiet for a while, check with another station. Make sure your equipment didn't fail or their equipment didn't fail, right? That's something that I've encountered on an event net that I was participating in. My handheld, it was the second day of the event, and my handheld, I had forgotten to charge it the night between the 2 days, and I was just sitting there thinking, man, the net's quiet today. Picked up my radio and looked at it, and it was off. And I'm like, oh crap, you know. And so then I got my backup radio and I turned it on and I checked in with net control and said, hey, did I miss anything? I don't know how long my radio's been dead, but it could have been anything up to 15, 20 minutes, you know. And fortunately I hadn't missed anything, but that's something that can happen, right? So if you notice, oh, I haven't heard anything in a while, maybe I'll look at my equipment and make sure it's actually still functioning. Or maybe I'll throw a call out and say, hey, station 6 or whatever, are you there? And when they check in, you say, copy that, just wanted to make sure the radio was still working, right? So it doesn't hurt to do that periodically. Use tactical call signs. We had a class on tactical call signs a while ago. I should have put a link in here to that class, but use tactical call signs because it reduces confusion. And you may think, well, no, that's going to add to confusion. I have to remember that I'm station X when I'm just me, right? I'm KD7ZWV. I know who I am, but it reduces confusion on the whole net, right? Now, everybody doesn't have to remember, oh, KD7ZWV is at Grant Elementary. He's checking in as Grant Elementary. This is Grant Elementary. I need net control, blah, 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 right? Use those tactical call signs. And don't forget to ID. Remember, we all need to use our ID every 10 minutes that we've talked or at the end of our transmission. So don't forget to do that. When you're running a net, if you're the net control and somebody throws a comment in and they forget to ID, mention it, give them a chance to come back and ID because you don't want them breaking the rules, just like you don't want to break the rules, right? Net control requirements. You want to have a good location for your net control. You want to have a location where you have good signal, both strength and clarity to and from the repeater if you're using a repeater. If you're using simplex, you want to be somewhere centrally located where everybody can reach you. Or you want to have, you know, appropriate equipment that has a good antenna or something like that so that everybody can reach you. If you start out a net as a net control and another station comes on and offers to take over, but they are marginal in some way, you can't hear what they're saying very well, it's kind of scratchy or slow power, their modulation is low or whatever, don't hand it over to them. You have the authority to say, no, I'm going to keep it for now. Maybe you can get to my location and take over. You can get to the EOC and take over from a better radio there or something like that. You don't want to hand net control over to a station that's marginal. You want to have a location where you are able to communicate with your served agency very well, right? So it makes sense to have net control be at the EOC because that's where the mayor is going to be. That's where the chief of the fire department is going to be. That's where, you know, the people who are trying to run the event are going to be. So you want to be co-located with them so you can communicate with them as easily. You want a location that's robust and reliable, has backup power, maybe has a backup radio. Remember the saying, 2 is 1, 1 is none. In my example where my radio died, if I hadn't had my second radio handy, I'd have been done, right? I'd have been, well, I guess I'm finished. I'll call the net control on the phone and tell them I'm done, you know, so, but, damn.
So my question to all MARC members is how many people had 2 radios on the parade? In case one of them had issues. I don't wanna know. But something to think about.
And how many people have 2 radios that can operate on the 1.25 meter band, right? I mean, I've got 2, I've got 3, I've got 4. But you know, did I think to take a second radio? I didn't take a second radio. Sam took one, right? So what was that, Vern?
Or did you take a second battery?
Or a second battery? I don't have a second battery for that radio, right? So, you know, that's a case of poor planning on my part. Is what if my radio, I did charge it the night before, but what if I dropped it and broke it? You know, what if for whatever reason I wasn't able to use that radio? Didn't plan for that. That's something to think about. Consider having multiple net control locations and be able to let a backup take over if the primary goes offline. That's something that can be very useful. You know, have a station, any station could be net control, right? But obviously you won't, so say we had our command net set up and we had a station at each of the safe neighborhood schools and we had one at the EOC. If the EOC went offline, any of our safe neighborhood schools could take over as net control for the rest of the net. That would be okay. But ideally, we want the best station to be the net control, right? And be prepared. Have the materials you need, forms, any kind of logs, logbooks, pen, paper, pencil, frequency lists. Have that information handy and be familiar with them. You don't want to be reading the frequency list for the first time when the emergency is happening. You want to be comfortable enough to say, oh, I know the Murray frequency is this. And if I need to call somebody in Taylorsville, it's this. And I know what they are. And I have them programmed in my radio and I'm ready to use them if I need to. You don't want to be thinking, oh, shoot, who was that? I need to call Taylorsville and tell them what? Oh, where's Taylorsville? Where did I put my list of net frequencies? You want to know where that information is. You want to be prepared, have that information handy and have referred to it before. So you're not trying to learn it during the emergency. Records are critically important to this type of a situation, an emergency communications net. If you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. Okay. So you want to keep accurate logs. You want to log messages that were received. You want to log messages that were sent. You want to log that they were responded to or not responded to. You want to keep track of past, current, and future assignments. So for a particular operator who is at a particular location, you want to know where they're at. You don't want to be wondering, where is that station or where is that operator? Who is at station X or whatever? You want to have that information on paper in front of you so you can refer to it. You even want to track non-message events. For example, I had to switch to the backup radio at such and so time, or the city power went out and we had to fire up the generator at such and so time. You want that logged as an event in your records. And that way, when everything's all done and you're evaluating how you did and how things went, you can actually say, oh, well, this happened at this particular time and we did this and we went on from there, right? So using standardized forms helps you to avoid missing things. These forms were created for a reason. They have fields to fill out for different things, and those fields are there to fill out. And so you are prompted, oh, I didn't remember I was supposed to put down the time that this particular message had, but there's a time column on my form next to the message line. So that encourages me to write the time in there, and then I don't forget to do that, right? We're going to have a class on forms at some point, but we're not going to go dig into that very much today. Keep your logs on file. So the recommendation was to keep them for a year. I don't know if you need to keep them for a year. Maybe keep them until after the after action report has been sent in, right? Be willing to send copies of your forms to the incident commander after everything is done. That would be a good thing to be able to do, right? You may be asked later how something was handled. And if you've got logs of what you did, then you can say, well, I did this. It's in my log, right? All right. So if you're not the net control, you need to remember the net control is the boss. They're in charge of the net. Same thing applies. Listen before you transmit. Make sure the frequency is clear. Be short, concise, and use accurate messages. Be prepared to move to an alternate frequency for traffic in order to clear traffic. So this is, remember I was talking about if two stations want to go direct. So say you've got an operator who's on a truck with a bunch of supplies and they don't know where to physically deliver it to a particular location where another operator is waiting for them. You may not want them to, as a net controller, you may not want them to have that conversation on the main net frequency. You may tell them, hey, you guys switch to tactical 1 and have your conversation, figure out where you are, meet up, get the supplies delivered, and then come back and tell me that it was done, right? And so be ready as an operator, a non-net control, be ready to move to another frequency if instructed to do so. Use the correct forms, use the correct procedures, comply with instructions from net control, and don't abandon your post or leave the net without letting net control know, right? Nothing is worse than net control assuming that you're at station X and finding out 3 hours later that there was nobody at station X anymore. You left, right? And you know, nobody told net control. That's a terrible thing.
I had in the early nineties, county areas was fairly active. We did a lot of events and we at different locations. Well, we had a new guy on net control and I didn't know him very well. And I tried to use a little humor most of the time when I talk to anybody. And
No.
the people I knew knew my procedure for different things, and we had just discussed a few things, and I had that in my mind. Anyway, I went to Pioneer Valley Hospital, and I was supposed to be checking into net control. Well, I did, but it was a long time there, and I had to go into the hospital. So I mentioned that I can't stand the pressure, I need to go to the hospital. Well, most people knew what I meant. I had to go pee. Well, the net control operator wasn't aware of that fact. He didn't really know me. And he got a little concerned because I didn't report in for a while. Well, it was a long walk to the hospital. It changed where I could go, so I took a lot longer than I planned. Well, I admit I wasn't very clear on what I had to do, but I also didn't want to say I have to go pee.
On the radio, right? Yeah.
On the radio. So, he got rather concerned that I was rather, upset about the whole thing, couldn't handle the pressure. And most people I knew what I was about to do, so, but he didn't, so.
Diapers, right, or diapers, talked about.
No, anyway, I wasn't very clear, but most people knew what I was referring to.
So again, it comes back to being concise and accurate in your messaging, right? If you had told him, hey, I need to relieve the pressure in my bladder, that would have been more obvious to him what you were doing and why it was taking you a while,
I
right?
must admit,
But-
I didn't know which would be better to tell. If I have to go pee or I have to go urinate.
Yeah, well,
To me, have to go urinate sounds worse than having to. So, but I've never figured that out. Maybe you can help me there.
you know,
Which would be best to say over the air.
I think saying things in the most concise and easy to understand fashion is the best. And so, I think I have to pee is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, even on the radio. There may be other things you could say that would not be necessarily legal, but yeah, so I would be okay, comfortable with that. Okay, so yeah, don't leave without letting net control know what you're doing. Report promptly when you become available. Make sure you route the use of the frequency through net control. So if you are on the radio, right, and the net control station exists and they're running the net and you need to make a call to somebody, run it through net control. Let them know, hey, this is station X. I need to talk to station Y for a minute. They may tell you, okay, go direct on frequency, blah, blah, blah. Switch over to that frequency, do your thing, and then come back, right? Answer promptly when called by net control. Remember, you're listening. You're listening. So when they call you, you hear them, right? Use your tactical call signs as assigned by net control. Follow the protocols that have been established. When net control asks you for information, write down what they're asking you for before you try to respond. Because if you don't write it down when they ask you, you may get it wrong. You think, well, it's only going to be 5 seconds. While I tell them, a lot can happen in 5 seconds. If they ask you something, write down the question that they ask you, figure out what you want to say to respond to it, write down what you're going to say back to them, and then say it, right? You want to keep that logged in your log, and you want to make sure you get it right. Don't forget, you need to take breaks too, as witnessed by Ragnar at the hospital there. He definitely needed to take a break, and he needed to communicate that fact accurately to net control. Let's see. Okay, our Zoomies have left us. They had to leave, and we are running a little bit late. You guys okay with me continuing? I've got about 9 more slides. All right. All right, so let's talk about order of calls. So calls have a priority, right? Emergency, priority, and routine are the 3 levels that are typically used. Emergency calls are the highest priority. Yeah, you make an emergency call when if you don't get an answer immediately, serious injury or death may result, right? A priority call would be, hey, something is happening. It's not deadly right now, but if we don't deal with it promptly, it's gonna get bad, right? So that would be considered a priority call. And then routine is basically everything else. So if you are on a net and you are a station and you are having to come back with some traffic and it is priority traffic, say that when you start making a call. Hey, net control, this is station X. I have priority traffic. And then if another station happens to come in and say, this is station Y, I have emergency traffic, net control is going to take the emergency traffic first, then they'll come back to you for the priority traffic. Meanwhile, the guy with routine traffic is just going to sit there and wait until you guys are all done, and then he can get in there with his routine traffic. You may hear other priorities used. Sometimes you'll hear urgent. That's similar to priority. You might hear welfare. You typically handle that at the routine level. You might hear low. Again, you typically would handle that at the routine level. Sometimes if somebody says, hey, I have a low priority message, you may save that until after other routine traffic has happened and then come back for that one, right? But those are things, levels of calls that you may want to deal with. This is the going direct thing that we talked about. If a station has traffic specifically for another station, they may ask to go direct. If the net isn't busy, net control could just say, go ahead with your traffic right there on the frequency. That's perfectly fine. Let the two stations talk to each other, get their thing worked out, and off they go. If the net's busy, net control may say, hey, move to tactical 1 or move to, repeater 5 or whatever to have your conversation, and then come back and tell me what the results were. Stations in close proximity to each other may use a tactical frequency, a simplex frequency, and low power for that kind of local communications. This would be similar to like police operations with a car-to-car frequency, where say you've got the highway patrol and they're cruising along. They've got one frequency that they communicate with their dispatcher on. They have another car-to-car frequency that they can use just to communicate with other highway patrol officers that are out there on the freeway with them at the same time. You want to keep extraneous conversation off the main net. Why don't we do this all the time? Main reason is if net control can't hear the traffic, they don't have a log of what was being done or what was being said. Those stations need to come back and report what happened after the fact, right? So after two stations go direct, they work out whatever they need to work out. When they're all done with that, they come back to net control and say, hey, we did this. So net control has a record of that information. All right, let's talk about some challenges that you may encounter as net control operator for an emergency communications net. You may encounter a bozo or a B0ZO operator. This would be someone who doesn't follow the rules for whatever reason. They may be an idiot. They may be a bad person. They may be trying to interfere. You don't necessarily know or care why, but the main thing that you need to do is be patient. Try to educate them if you can. Don't try to call out the problem station directly. You want to avoid direct confrontation on the net. If you can lead the bozo back to proper operation by example, do that. Sometimes you can use, this is XYZ net, we're doing this, I'm the net control, route all messages through me. Not saying, bozo, you're dumb, don't talk to Dingo on the net, talk to me first and I'll let you talk to Dingo if he needs, if I need to. If necessary, invite bozo to come to net control to handle your logging or your paperwork or be a runner or something like that. Get them off the radio and get them doing something productive. That's another solution for that. These are some example bozos, right? The untrained observer. These are typically found in weather nets. Hey, it stopped raining over here. Okay, where? It's by the mall. Which mall? By Fashion Place Mall. Oh, okay. Thanks. Next station, whatever, right? You don't really care on a weather net that it stopped raining. You care about, hey, it's hailing the size of boxcars down here. That's a bad thing, right? Those are the things you care about. The irate participant, somebody who, darn it, you're not doing it the way that they should do it, or the way that you should do it. And I'm going to tell you on the radio right now why I think you're doing it wrong and what I think you need to be doing right. When possible, take it offline. Hey, can you call me at this number? And then get them off the radio. You can deal with them on the phone without interrupting the rest of the things going on the net, right? One of the things you can do, acknowledge the problem. Hey, I think you're doing this wrong. Oh, yeah. Boy, that could be happening. Tell me what you would suggest to solve that problem. Get them involved in a solution, not have them talking about the problem, have them talking about a solution to the problem. Whether you adopt their solution or not, that's up to you to decide. You're the net control, right? But acknowledging them defuses the situation and gets them back on your side, basically, right? So think about that. The interferer, these are people who, for whatever unknown reason, just want to get in your way. Not much you can do about that. Ignore them if possible. One of the things that you can do is have a planned backup frequency and tell everybody on the net, hey, we're going to switch to frequency B. Don't say we're switching to this numbered frequency because your bozo will follow you. But, have everybody on the net already know, or in your net documentation, we're going to switch to the backup frequency now. And everybody switch over there. Maybe they'll try to follow you. Maybe they won't. You do what you can. Right.
Inevitably, you'll get a bozo saying, you mean the 146?
Yeah, right. Yep, exactly. Right. So be aware of that kind of situation, right? So you may have too much to handle. Your net might get super busy and you may have too much to handle. Use a subnet, spin up a resource net or a traffic net or something like that to handle those things. Delegate, get that stuff off of what you're doing so that you can do what you're doing effectively, right? Only handle priority traffic from the subnets. So you're not dealing with every single thing that they do or say. You're only dealing with the important things that need to come back to the incident commander or to the authority that's helping, right? Or that's in charge. Liaisons, you want to act as a filter between two nets. You may assign an operator, hey, I'm spinning up a resource net. Operator X, you're the liaison between resource net A and the command net. So you're responsible for figuring out what things happen on resource net A that I need to know about on the command net. And when I have something for resource net A, I will give it to you and you give it to the resource net. You don't want to have to necessarily deal with that. Utilize a liaison. They will act as a filter and take some of that load off of you as the net control. Use relay stations. Sometimes you'll have a situation where two stations can't hear each other. This was talked about earlier. I don't remember who was saying it. I think it was Ragnar was talking about, we were operating as a station and we couldn't, the station that needed to get the message to the coast couldn't get it there, but they could get it to us. And then we were able to get it there. Use those relay stations. You want to use those typically on HF nets. You typically don't have that kind of problem on a VHF net or a repeater, but you can use them in simplex operation when you need to. If you're asked to be a relay station, it can be helpful to have two radios, or at least a radio that can listen on two VFOs at the same time, right? You may be asked to move to a location where you can hear another station or reach another station. If you happen to be, at a particular spot, and by going up to the roof of the building, you can pick up another station that's far away or that's in a particular location that you couldn't hear from the ground, you may be asked to relocate and act as a relay station. It's really a good idea to figure this kind of stuff out before the emergency. I think I've said that about 16 times now as we go through this process, but these are the kinds of things you work out during exercises and during drills and in regular operating when you're talking to people just on the radio. If you realize, well, shoot, I'm using our repeater, but I just realized that when I'm in Woods Cross, I can hear it fine. But if I'm up by the temple in Bountiful, I can't reach our repeater at all. Now I know that. And I know if I happen to be there when the emergency happens and I need to get to that, I need to use a relay station to get my message across. You want to learn that stuff before the emergency happens. Incident command system, we've talked about that briefly throughout. This is too big to go into right now. We'll talk about it in another meeting. And one of the key things that comes down to this is practice, practice, practice. Be willing to learn. Listen to constructive criticism. Volunteer for other events. Check out Utah SAG or ARPSE. There are events happening all the time. There's the Iron Lung event this weekend. They're still looking for operators, I understand. Find out about it, get involved. Any event you participate in gives you valuable experience that you will be able to utilize when called upon to act in an emergency. Volunteer to help, be net control. Work a station, work a SAG post, whatever. Practice. Dan Alongo mentioned this to me the other day. He says, I'll sit there and listen to nets and I'll just practice writing down call signs as people check in, just to get the practice of doing it, of listening to them give their call sign and hearing what they're saying and writing it down. I do that sometimes when I hear two stations talking. I'll listen, write down their call signs. I'll go look them up on QRZ later to figure out who they actually were. But just the factor of hearing how people give their call signs, listen to that, helps you program your brain to be able to listen to things like that. Dan.
Just another thing that I do a lot, and that's read off the license plates. You know, you're traveling, and I'm always, doing the license plates and phonetic. And, I do all of the net control stuff. There's a lot of net control operators that just say N7XBL. And I wish they would get in the habit of
saying
phonetics.
November 7 X-ray Delta Lima. Then it programs it into your brain, right? Yeah. Dan makes the point that while he's driving along, he'll see another driver with, a car going by, and he'll read the license plate off phonetically to get practice thinking phonetically. Oh, that's Uniform Hotel Papa 315. Okay. Now I've said that, and I've associated those letters and digits with the words in my brain, right? Monitor HF pileups during contests and try to copy the call signs of stations as they're trying to check in. That's a great thing to do if you're trying to figure out how to teach yourself. Yeah, I mean, exactly. You're not going to get them all, but it gives you experience listening and trying to get that into your brain and get your brain thinking, oh, that's a call sign. It sounds like this. It starts with this. It ends with this. There's a 7 in the middle. There's a 4 in the middle. There's whatever, you'll listen and you'll hear that. If you don't have an HF radio, use the web SDR. We have this amazing SDR site up in Corinne that you can get to on the internet and tune in to any of the bands. There's it's got even 2,200 meters all the way up to what do they have, a 2 meter? I think they even have a UHF receiver out there.
VHF, yes.
VHF, I know they have VHF. Do they have a UHF one? They may not have a UHF one. But yeah, I mean, tune into that thing. That'll give you some practice listening, and it'll also help you develop those skills that you're going to need when you upgrade your license and you're trying to do operations on HF. Write things down. Practice writing down notes on what's going on. When you're hearing a net, if you're sitting there at home and you're listening to a net, write down what they're talking about. Even if it's not something that you have any interest in, you get in the habit of writing down what you're hearing. And then when you're called upon to be a net control for an event, you'll have that habit and you'll be able to do it. Write down the things you plan to say on the air. Practice reading them. Practice listening. Remember, listening is so important. Bad signals are out there. Try to understand what's being said. Well, the more you learn how to listen, how to teach yourself how to listen. This was one that hit me. Tune your radio off by 5 kilohertz from the frequency where they're actually talking. That will add some static and some noise into the signal. And then you'll be listening to a degraded signal, and you can practice listening to degraded signals that way. I had never thought of doing that. Practice listening to HF. Pretty soon you won't hear the noise. You'll just hear the talking, right? You'll have taught your brain how to filter out the hisses, cracks, and pops, and you'll only hear the content, right? Volunteer to be net control for your local club net. We encourage all of our members to be net control. We run through a cycle. We try to get everybody to do it. Not everybody wants to do it, and that's okay, but we strongly encourage it. We really mean it. We want you to be the net control this Sunday, Dan. Now, I don't know who Jeff wants to be the net control this Sunday, but yeah, we want people to be net control. We want people to practice being net control. Okay, that is what I have. So a lot of this information came from Idaho Aries Net Control Station Training Manual. I have a link to that here in the slides. These slides will be posted on the website, so you don't have to remember all these links and all this information. You'll be able to go back and refer to it. I will post the video as well, which has all of my melodious tones as I've talked about all of these different things, and all of your comments as well. So please feel free to refer to that, point people at it, let people listen to it and follow along and get everybody learning what's going on. Any final comments, questions, or anything else from the gallery here?
Thank you, Glenn.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording and we will